Hi, welcome to Health Center from Downstate Medical Center. I'm Dr. Gerald Deas, your host today, to talk about a very important subject that you might not think of, just generally, what people do or what people eat. They're always talking about nutrition, what minerals and things you need, but have you ever thought of things that you can eat and get sick? Of course, lead poisoning, for example, pica, children picking the paint off the walls of apartment houses that have been yearly painted with lead paint, and then that plaster that's coming off the wall is loaded with lead. My wife did a great study on that while she was at Queens College on how children were getting lead intoxication from just paint off the walls, and it's called pica, and it's around and still all over the world as such. But here in the United States, there's another thing that we're really interested in too, is mercury. And when you talk about mercury, you might just think of mercury in the bottom of a thermometer, and the mercury that is mixed with the amalgam that they fill your teeth with at one time. They used to use silver and mercury to fill your teeth, and of course that was another source of getting mercury intoxication. But mercury is all over the place. You just can't imagine. And a person right here in Brooklyn, and connected even with Brooklyn College, been working on this for many years about mercury intoxication, because you can get all kind of neurological signs. You can involve your IQ even, or other neurological diseases and things like this. So today we're going to just try to explore this whole mercury problem, where it's at, who's doing what, how can we help it, what should we do, ask the politicians to participate in. So we're going to be discussing this today. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Windroff, connected with Brooklyn College, but he's all over the world, Africa, doing all kinds of prevention measures and diseases and things in Africa. But right here in Brooklyn, we have him working on this very important subject of mercury. Dr. Windroff?
How do you do, Dr. Deas? Thank you for having me back again.
Yes, we've been along these lines for a long time with mercury.
On a number of occasions, yes, indeed.
Your beard has gotten gray, and my hair, I don't have any hair. So basically, we have AIDS in this whole fight against mercury. But just to give a little background so you can make sure people understand who you are and what you're about, just a little of your background.
Well, I'm a graduate of Erasmus Hall High School here in Brooklyn and Brooklyn College, and did my master's in education there, my undergrad in bio, and then ultimately ended up finishing up a PhD in medical sociology at the CUNY Grad Center. And in the interim, I was for 2 years a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, where I ended up going back many times since the late 60s to do my doctoral research in traditional African medicine and sorcery beliefs. And that led me to, in June of '89, which is why we're here now, with that as a background, I made my money as a New York City junior high school science teacher, and I had been assigned a special ed learning disabled class in 1988-89 school year. In the late June of '89, I'm teaching these 6 or 8 children, 9th graders, they were no longer children, about chemistry, and we were wending our way through the periodic table of the elements, and that fateful day in late June of '89, we hit mercury, and I asked these 6 or 8 students if they knew what mercury was used for. They were students, children of color for the most part, who we know are disproportionately represented in the ranks of special ed and learning disabilities. And a ethnically Puerto Rican boy, a very articulate young man, raised his hand, and instead of saying it's used in thermometers, which is what you alluded to and what I was expecting, he said, "My mother uses it in Santeria." And I knew a little bit about Santeria from my readings in the occult for my doctoral research. What does she do with it? I asked, and he retorted, "She sprinkles it on the floor to keep away brujo, or witches," which I knew not a Spanish speaker. And after class, I asked him where she got it, and he said, oh, at the Botanica on Fifth Avenue on Sterling Place. And I had some vague idea of what a Botanica was. Many of you know that there are stores that sell initially botanical herbal medicines, as well as the paraphernalia for religions such as Santeria, Voodoo, Espiritismo, etc. So I asked the boy if he could buy some for me and bring it back to school. And in a day or two, he came back with a colorless gelatin capsule. Actually, I forgot to bring it. It was on my list to do, but this was a short order here.
That's all right.
So it had a gross weight of 7.2 grams, and I visited the Botanica on my first free day, Saturday, a day or two later, and there behind the counter was a big jar of these gelatin capsules. And by an odd coincidence, the boy's mother happened to be there chatting with the lady behind the counter, and she recognized me from open school night, reiterated the story, and fast forward, and I knew a little bit about mercury toxicity. I immediately called up the New York City Department of Health and reported this to them, and they were not in the least interested. Mm-hmm. So a year or so later, I started reading up on mercury toxicity, and I came upon a syndrome called erethism, a behavioral syndrome, which you had alluded to earlier in terms of its behavioral manifestations. Yes. And it was a perfect fit for this boy. He was cranky and irritable. These are very fuzzy, but nevertheless, his other teachers and I agreed. He was anorexic, not merely skinny, which at the time I was as well, but he was really skinny, and he didn't eat anything during the lunch hours that I had to observe him for my lunchroom duty. He had short-term memory loss. Now, that's a big problem in school, and it was manifested to me and to others as well. He was very engaged. He would often have his hand in the air, and not infrequently it was to ask his teachers to repeat the question. So that's a learning disability, and he was in a learning disabled class. And then the most bizarre and unique symptom, a peculiar dislike of being observed. And I'm sitting there in the Columbia Medical Library, and I remember that periodically he would put his head in his desk, which we're all familiar with as teachers, and as students probably as well. But unique in my experience, he would periodically open up his loose-leaf notebook and invert it over his head, which could be construed as a way of not being observed in that classroom context. So that's what really got my juices flowing. And I hired that summer of 1990 a young, recent college grad, half Puerto Rican, half Cuban, and I went to the yellow pages and found the Botanicas under religious goods. She phoned up 115 Botanicas from LA to Chicago to Miami to Boston, and 99 out of the 115 stated that they were selling mercury. We visited, I believe it was 31 Botanicas in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and 28 of 31 were selling it. And we bought it and weighed it out, and she queried them as to how it was supposed to be used, and many of the ways included, among others, sprinkling it on floors were obviously going to contaminate housing. One of them, which I thought at the time would be extremely problematic, was putting the mercury in these votive candles, the glass-jacketed candles. And I thought, oh, wow, we're going to evolve a lot of mercury vapor because it's going to be heated up. So I bought a dozen or so candles of the two different sizes and weighed into them measured weights, I think 2 or 4 grams of mercury to the best of my instrumentation, and lit them off in my parents' garage over in Flatbush, and got out expeditiously, and then came back as they had burned out and weighed the residual mercury. There was essentially minimal loss, well within my experimental error. And then I reported this, but it occurred to me that if in fact substantial amounts of mercury were volatilized, we would have a lot of cases of acute mercury poisoning. It hasn't happened, it doesn't happen, and what happens is that the layer of wax at the top of the candle melts. The mercury sinks down to the solid liquid interface. the bulk of the heat is convected up and you don't get much mercury being evolved. And the big issue, and the reason that we're here now 24, 25 years later, is that many of the practices expose the mercury to air, and one of the more common practices is sprinkling the mercury on floors. Once it's on the floor, it is persistent literally for several decades. Wow. And the problem is that the vapor is exquisitely developmentally neurotoxic at very low levels. Mm-hmm. And therefore, everyone in a home that has had mercury thrown on the floor in the last 20, 30 years is exposed. And the big problem is pregnant women, fetal exposure, infantile, lactating exposures. And no one knows. The exposures are at second hand, quote unquote, because in most cases, the people who are living there now did not live there when the mercury was thrown on the floor.
Right, right.
And the cost of cleanup begins in the several tens of thousands of dollars for this sort of spill.
Of course.
And the evacuation, the mandated government, federal, local, state evacuation level is 10 micrograms, 10 millionths of a gram a 28th of an ounce, 10 millionths of a gram per cubic meter. And the reoccupation level is only 1 microgram. And then EPA, Agency for Toxic Substances, their minimal risk level or reference dose, whichever it was, which is really for day in, day out exposure, for lifetime exposures, is either 2 or 3 tenths of a microgram per cubic meter. Wow. So we're talking about extremely developmentally neurotoxic stuff.
Yes.
And the public is unaware of it, and the clinical public is unaware of it. So that unlike lead, where there's this enormous awareness of this metallic developmental neurotoxin, no one knows, and many people don't want to know, and that's why we're here today.
Well, I'll tell you, in my community growing up, we had many cavities due to poor nutrition and other things. But silver fillings were the thing that they were putting in the mouths of children and adults. And they didn't realize that the amalgam that they were using, or the material they were using, had mercury in it along with the silver. And here they were being exposed to mercury even at that level, when you think about it. Nobody was paying much attention to mercury at that time. In fact, they took gorillas, for example, and they gave them something with mercury and to chew and so forth. And then they dissected the gorillas and found mercury all over the body. So basically, it's been around with us a long time, this metal.
Those levels, however, from dental fillings,
right.
they were using monkeys. They initially used sheep, then they did monkeys, then they sliced them up, put them on X-ray film, and as you said, they're found all over the body. But in toxicology, as it were, the poison is in the dose. And although the mercury is, you can find individual atoms of radioactive mercury on X-ray film, it's very, very little.
Right.
But here, for those people who are exposed, who are not the universe of everyone with amalgam fillings, but they are receiving enormous doses, and there's fetal exposure, which is the big problem, the windows of neurodevelopment.
Well, when you think of how old New York is, and the tenement houses, those 4 and 6 family houses and things like this, apartments, you can imagine if this procedure was being done within the homes and things like this, you can imagine that must be just loaded all over these old houses, and there's no way of detecting it other than now with machines that you can.
Well, to give you an idea, and the audience an idea of the magnitude of the problem, the best quantitative information comes out of Montefiore Medical Center, published in the American Journal of Public Health in January '96, the research done in '95. They did a universe survey of all the botanicas in the Bronx. There were 41 botanicas, 38 of them were selling mercury, none of it labeled. And 35 of the 38 places that were selling it were able to give the interviewer an estimate as to how much they sold a day. That 1996 data was crunched, as it were, by EPA Superfund's Ritualistic Uses of Mercury Task Force. It was in operation between 1999 and 2001.
Right.
And they calculated that in that 1 year of sales, the 35 of the 38 that were selling it sold somewhere between 25,000 and 150,000 odd 9-gram mean weight capsules of mercury, between 500 and 3,000 pounds of mercury in 1 year.
Wow.
And 29.3% of the individuals who were queried, surveyed, suggested it be sprinkled on the floors of homes. So at 1 unit of mercury per home, and we know in many cases it's done repeatedly, but worst case scenario, 1 unit per home, we would have somewhere in the Bronx in 1 year between 8,000 odd and 50,000 odd homes contaminated with the equivalent of a dozen thermometers worth of mercury not cleaned up. In 2002, the EPA, again, contracted with the New York Academy of Sciences to do a report on sources of mercury entering the New York, New Jersey harbor as the first of a series of about 10 monographs on toxic influx to the harbor, required as a prelude to dredging the harbor to accommodate the new ships that are going to be coming online next year, I think, from the enlarged Panama Canal in order for our harbor to remain competitive. So the first, given the importance of mercury, the known toxicity of it, the first monograph they did was mercury. And they found 17 recurrent identifiable sources. Number one being dental offices from amalgam fillings, which is still a big thing. I think it was about 4,000 kilograms a year. Whatever it was a lot of mercury. Number 17 down at the bottom of this horizontal bar graph, a few dozen pounds of mercury, also from fillings, but instead of from dentists, from crematoria, where the mercury fillings that are in your mouth, if you're cremated, are volatilized, go up in the air, are washed out, enter the harbor. Now, right in the middle, whatever that middle point of 17 is, about 8 or so, it was basically a tie. You had smokestack emissions from coal-fired electric power plants, which Congress has done an enormous amount of legislation on, forcing the electric companies to retrofit their mercury-emitting boilers with scrubbers to remove mercury, because coal, which is the major source of fuel for these furnaces, contains tiny amounts of mercury, but enormous tonnages of coal are burned, so a lot of mercury is going up into the air. The median amount of mercury released by these power plants that was going into the harbor was 400 kilograms a year. Immediately above that bar was religious and cultural uses of mercury, virtually indistinguishable at a median of about 400 kilograms a year, and the range or error bar for both the boilers and the religious use was essentially the same, between 200 and 600 kilograms a year. But the big difference is that smokestack emanations from coal-fired power plants are up there a few hundred feet up in the top of the smokestack, and in order to get into you as a pregnant woman, you have to be eating fish that have been at the top of the food chain, and you have a choice about that. But the mercury, same amount going into the harbor, that is from its ritualistic, religious/cultural use. Its starting, its source is your apartment, and you have no control over that. The levels of mercury vapor that you're inhaling are many orders of magnitude greater than what you'd have at the top of a smokestack, and you have no choice and no knowledge that it's happening. So that's what's going on. So we have a lot of homes that are certain to be contaminated. Actually, one other point.
Sure.
The New York City Department of Environmental Protection runs 14 wastewater treatment plants. Every now and then they do a survey of heavy metals entering those plants. And they've noticed, when I put it to them, that there were some anomalies, elevated levels of mercury associated with Caribbean Latino ethnicity. So they did a targeted sampling some years ago based on the fact that they found one wastewater treatment plant serving an enormous Caribbean community. All of the South Bronx, southwestern Bronx, and all of northeastern Manhattan with an enormous excess of mercury. And who's living up in northeastern Manhattan, southwestern Bronx? Tremendous numbers of Caribbean people, Latino, Caribbean, Puerto Rican, Dominican, etc. So they did some targeted analyses which were basically inconclusive and were not shared with the health department or the EPA. No one really wanted to follow up, but they did find this big excess coming into that particular plant, and no one has wanted to know
Now, when you
anymore.
talk about, we'll just go off an angle here, a fish with mercury, shellfish.
Hardly much in shellfish. It's all fish that are at the top of the food chain. That smokestack emissions of mercury, which is one of the biggest ones generically around the country, around the world, that mercury is washed out, mercury oxide, sulfides, etc., is washed out into waters.
I see.
And in the sediments at the bottom of, and some in the water column, but mostly in the sediments in shallow water, there are bacteria that ingest, absorb that mercury and mercury compounds that are coming out of a variety of sources. Some of them are human or related, and some of them are geological.
Right.
And they change that mercury, inorganic mercury, elemental mercury, into an organic compound called methyl mercury. So you have these bacteria that are invisible, microscopic, that are turning the inorganic mercury into methyl organic mercury, and then those bacteria are ingested by small crustaceans. The crustaceans are ingested by very small fish. The small fish are ingested by bigger and bigger fish, whales, etc. At the top of the food chain, the biggest, oldest carnivorous fish contain the most methyl mercury. And that methyl mercury is readily absorbed by your digestive system.
Yes.
And because it's very fat soluble, it goes all over the body, through the placenta into the fetus, through the blood-brain barrier into the brain, and it's extremely developmentally neurotoxic, which are why there are all of these advisories, fish advisories, especially to pregnant women, women of childbearing age. So that's the way the methyl mercury works, and there's a tremendous literature on developmental neurotoxicity resulting from methyl mercury ingestion. And the methyl mercury, the toxic part of that methyl group attached to a mercury atom, is the mercury atom. And the methyl group simply facilitates its transport through your body. And in the case of what we're discussing here, the elemental mercury vapor that you inhale is, like methyl mercury, very, very fat soluble and readily passes through cell membranes into cells where it's oxidized. So what happens is that if you breathe in the mercury vapor emanating from the floor of your home, 80% of the mercury atoms that you breathe in will be absorbed in each breath in your lungs. And for a half a minute or so, they will circulate all over your body, and they will enter your brain, they will enter your breast milk, they will enter your fetus, etc., and they will not do any good to any of those parts of your body or your developing fetus's body. That's the big problem. It's the mercury atom, not the ion. Once it becomes ionized intracellularly, it's trapped.
Right.
But as with methyl mercury, it's highly developmentally neurotoxic.
You know, Benjamin Feingold 50 years ago showed things that children eat cause all kinds of attention deficit disorders and things like this. And little has science really looked at the food that the children are eating or what it's doing to them. And he showed all the hyperactivity and all the neurological signs that these children are having, and poor areas particularly. And you would think that after all the reporting you have done and the papers you have written and visiting different countries and things like this, why hasn't the FDA come into this picture?
Well, good question. When I initially, in my earlier naivete in the early 90s, I put it to the FDA, and they very reasonably stated that it's not their problem because it is not it certainly is not a food, and it is not touted as a drug. It doesn't fall within their ambit, within their responsibility. It's used in various traditional medicinal applications, but there's nothing written about it, so they really don't have a handle on it. The entity that does, and made a feeble attempt at addressing it, is the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And I had gone down to the FDA has offices in Brooklyn along the waterfront, and they told me that, and I had it in writing from them. But the Consumer Product Safety Commission does have the authority, because this is a consumer product, and it's sold in violation of the federal consumer product safety labeling regulations, and ditto for the New York City Department of Health labeling regulations, where anything that's remotely toxic has to have an identification label and a warning label.
Right.
So these little capsules or vials of mercury are tiny little things. In general, they have no room for a label. A number of them, mostly from a supplier in California, would be sold in a little vial, and then the vial would be put into a plastic polyethylene envelope, and that envelope or packet would have a label inside it. But the vast majority are sold in either gelatin capsules or small plastic or glass vials that have no label whatsoever. So that's a violation. And in the early 90s, I persuaded the Consumer Product Safety Commission to subpoena a wholesaler of Botanica supplies, including mercury, an outfit called Almacenes Shango that was located on Upper Madison Avenue. And they came down to the World Trade Center area where the Consumer Product Safety Commission had its offices, and they stated, which we knew already, that they were selling the mercury. I had ascertained that myself. They were wholesaling it. They claimed that they were wholesaling it to a variety of retail botanicas, and they claimed that they had several industrial clients, and they claimed that they could not disentangle what they sold to the industrial clients as opposed to the botanicas. Now, the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, made no attempt to really look at their books, nor did they make any attempt to widen their investigation. The source of the mercury at that time was an outfit called Belmont Metals, if I remember, that had their factory in the East New York area of Brooklyn. They've since moved to New Jersey. They were a big re-refiner. They would collect used mercury. And
Could I just say one
sure.
thing, Dr. Wendell? Because time is our enemy. We have to carry this conversation further, because you're just scratching the surface right now. So I'd like to continue this discussion with this very important health item. And there are many health items in our community, but mercury has not been really put under any kind of control that it should be put under. So I want to welcome you back to continue this discussion so we can get deeper into it. So you folks out there, I hope just from the discussion you heard thus far about mercury, it's not just on the mercury on the feet. The
winged messenger.
Winged messenger. We have a winged messenger right here about mercury. That's all I'd like you to invite you to come back, and so we can further discuss this topic. See you next time.